Hi, Michelle.
Hey, Dayo. How are you?
Dayo. I'm great.
Dayo. So I'm so sorry.
No, it's fine. We've had a very sort of internet-y correspondence. We've never actually met, but I was really excited to do this Blogging Heads because I read a review of your book, which I really enjoyed, and have admired all of the writing you've been doing over the past few years on feminism and globalization. So
thank you. Just the other day, I had a party and somebody asked me if I had, someone told me I should meet you, and I was telling him how much I wanted to. Although, obviously, I forgot how to pronounce your name correctly, even
it happens all the time.
Told me.
In due time.
But, anyway, so I'm Michelle Goldberg. I'm the author of The Means of Reproduction and a columnist for the Daily Beast, a columnist for the American Prospect, and I write for a bunch of other places.
And I'm Dayo Olopade. I'm a reporter for The Root here in D.C. I also write for a lot of different publications, including XX, and I'm a fellow at New America. And I'm very excited to be here chatting with you, Michelle, on the very, very last day of a very, very ugly decade, depending on how you look at it. And I feel like the sort of central theme, at least as far as I can tell for this decade, has been terror. Fear of the unknown, fear of the sort of dark underbelly of globalization and what it means. And I think that, this Christmas we all saw the manifestation of this new order when, what are we calling him now? I mean, we know the name. The name is Umar Farouk Abdul-Muttalib. Panty-bomber?
That's what I picked up on, and I'm not exactly sure where I got it from.
Okay, well, that's fair enough. Panty-bomber Umar Farouk Abdul-Muttalib tried to blow up an airplane traveling from Amsterdam to Detroit. We all know the story by now, but I think what surprised me the most, sitting with my Nigerian family on Christmas Day as the news came over from CNN, was how surprising it was to see an individual actually carry out an attack, given all of the security that we've been subjected to since 2001, and also that this person came from West Africa.
I mean, the fact that he is actually able to carry it out or not able to carry it out, or that doesn't surprise me that much, just because I fly so much and have, kind of been pretty well aware of what a farce and a ridiculous kabuki our airline security screening system is. I think it's astonishing. There's that kind of old cliche about history repeating itself the first time as tragedy, the second time as farce. I mean, it's astonishing how apt that is, and how, the decade started out with this, but in terms of what we think of as the last decade. Yeah,
we can start with 9/11. I'm comfortable with that.
Right, begins on September 11th, 2001. And now you have this, attempted repeat, but it ends up being kind of so incredibly absurd and ridiculous. It was so ridiculous that it was kind of hard. It actually took me a while before I realized that it was actually serious.
Right. Well, I think the details that have emerged, which is that he's got this packet of, dangerous explosives sewed into his underwear, and then that he tried to activate. And, the initial details were ludicrous, but the more I listened to the story and sort of follow the TikTok of how the intelligence failures and the security failures unfolded, leading up to the events of the Christmas Day attempt, the more I sort of think that this is very serious. It reminds me a little bit of that party crashing incident at the White House over just before Thanksgiving at the first state dinner, where at first it was like, well, these people are just sort of fame, star. Well, I'm not going to swear, but you know what I mean. And then finally it was sort of, this actual security breach where these people were able to, press the flesh of our president and our vice president. And so the more I learn about how Abdul-Muttalib managed to not have his visa revoked from the State Department, about how his father informed, U.S. officials about some of his disturbing beliefs and some of his statements, and how he got on a plane in 2 airports headed for the States, and about how, were it not for the actions of some, brave and alert passengers, we'll probably be having the same conversation, the way things have unfolded, but it's just surprising to me that, there were 100 different stations of the cross at which this could have been averted, and it was not until the very last moment.
Yeah, to me, the part about his father turning him in is astonishing. And also also in certain ways what makes it seem so different than the stories of some of the other terrorists. I mean, especially the terrorists who from September 11th. That I'm not saying I have no reason to think that their families were at all
on board,
sympathetic to what they did. But he came from a context in which there wasn't even, kind of any ambivalence. I mean,
right.
Nigeria especially, it just doesn't seem like there's any, you have, a pretty conservative Muslim, is it northern Nigeria?
Yeah, I mean, the country is 50% Muslim, and that's mostly
right. But there just seems to be no there just seems, as far as I know, and you can tell, I'm sure you know better than me, that there just seems to be no kind of supportive social context for this sort of thing.
Well, there are two sort of frameworks that you can use to look at this. I mean, one is that you could think of this person as a creature of a creation of Nigerian society, and in that sense, I think it's a useful frame. I mean, he has. He was, grew up in Nigeria as a Nigerian national, was raised in sort of cosmopolitan fashion, but ultimately, is from, a Muslim family that lives in Nigeria. And religion in that country is, particularly, it's not something that is seen as, radical. It's not something that, has a political context, but it is something that in the 50% of the country that's Muslim, and the 40% of the country that's Christian, and in the rest of the 10% that practices various different religions, people are deeply faithful.
Right.
It doesn't usually have a political context, and here, I think we've seen the cross-pollination of the religious fervor that, there was a lot of talk about Sharia law being enacted in Nigeria over this last decade in the north part of the country. But I would call that more a symptom of disorder and chaos than a symptom of politicized Islam, where people wanted to have some kind of framework in a place where the law was not working.
Right. Well,
and so Sharia law entered. But, that's one context for it. The other one is that this is a creature of the West.
Right, and that's what I wanted to ask. Do you think, is he mostly a creature of the West and specifically of London?
Well, I feel like, and it was very personal for me because this person is a couple of years younger than I am. I was born in America, but I spent a lot of time in Nigeria. My sister lives in Lagos. I've spent time, going out to the clubs over the Christmas holidays in Nigeria, and I know people this is a man who I could easily have spent, an evening kicking back a beer with in any of the sort of trendy clubs of Lagos or London or New York. And so there is a certain sense, and not unlike Osama bin Laden, who came from a very wealthy family, had spent time in the West, this person, Abdul Muttalib, seemed to be, and we've seen from some of the great reporting that people at the Washington Post have done and stuff that the New York Times has done tracking his time in London, in Yemen, we've seen that this person, at the same time that he loved, that there was went to a Quranic school to learn Arabic in Yemen, was enthralled by the fact that there was a KFC and a Pizza Hut there, and posted these facts on his Facebook wall. So
well, that's the thing. His
there's
Facebook
a sort
wall
of
in general is such a strange and kind of banal document.
Yeah.
That he just was kind of, in certain ways he was the most kind of typical alienated, lonely kind of person that I wonder
he could have done Columbine, maybe.
Right, exactly. Psychologically, if he had been born in a different context, he might be just shooting up his high school. Not just, but that it's really just this kind of male alienation that you have in almost every context.
I think there might, I don't know, there might be more to it, because again, I'm looking at, and I read a piece about, the bomber and what it means for the American effort to fight terror, not just in the Middle East, as we've been sold this Middle Eastern problem since 9/11. Now it's a problem that implicates the African continent from east to west to south to north. But I also pointed out that the people we've been arresting, think of Zazi, who was arrested in September. Richard Reed, was an American, the shoe bomber. Those 5 Virginian men who are now being prosecuted.
Wait, was Richard Reed American? I thought he was English.
Well, sorry, not American, but people who had spent time in the West. The folks who perpetrated the Madrid bombings, the folks who perpetrated the tube bombing in London in 2007. These are people who weren't. I mean, Zazi was an Afghan national, but had spent time in America. Osama bin Laden had spent time in the West. I mean, I just wonder what it is that we're doing in these foreign theaters where we feel like that is the intervention we've been told is going to solve the problem, when we have most of the people we've actually been able to apprehend having spent time, among us, as it were. Mm-hmm. I just wonder what that says.
That's true of Saeed Qutb also, right? Who's the kind of fundament, or the ideologue behind so much.
Or the Fort Hood shooter.
Well, the Fort Hood shooter was almost, he just seemed to be kind of completely American.
Right.
Whereas, to me what's interesting is that there's, with somebody like the panty-bomber, to a certain degree maybe with Osama bin Laden, certainly with Saeed Qutb, there's something about the West and like their encounter with the West that there's this kind of, it seems like this secret attraction, and this almost kind of overwhelming sense of desire that they're then, kind of furiously repressing and fighting against.
And accompanied by shame and sort of guilt, and then, and then sort of a sort of destructive outcome. That is interesting. I don't know what that is. I feel like I don't want to give too much credence to the Dinesh D'Souza's of the world, but I do think that it would be more useful for the United States to sort of, in addition to tightening up security procedures, and, President Obama has already called for a review of the way the terror watch list gets put together, and a review, I guess, that we'll know more about next week, of what Homeland Security will plan to reform its system of tracking terrorists. But in addition to that, it might be useful to think about ways of, and the U.S. is probably better at this than, say, Britain or France, but ways of really trying to thoughtfully interrogate the psychology of the outsider, whether it's of a religious or ethnic or economic minority, and see the ways that, the Zazi story, and there was a fantastic New York Times profile of this. This was a guy who ran a cart, on Wall Street.
Right.
The carts we know. The ones that sell the coffee and the bagels. How American is that? And yet, I think there's something to the sort of ceiling of opportunity that this person perceived, and the credit card debt that he was racking up that was quintessentially American, and I think just really thinking critically about the way we treat outsiders, the way our society provides opportunity to immigrants, and finds ways of not necessarily having a multicultural model the way Britain does.
Well, the thing is, there's things you can do, proactively in terms of kind of economic opportunity and, giving people room for advancement and human flourishing. Where what I would hate to see is any kind of compromise in terms of, it's what they would consider the moral decadence, or the kind of, moral looseness that so appalls them about the West, or, the things that I think are precisely what are worth defending about the West. I am very much to the left on most aspects of kind of the whole debate about the war on terror, but I also understand why people in Holland, and various parts of Western Europe are so panicked about the shifts that their cultures are undergoing.
Right.
With Muslim
and we saw what happened in
immigration.
Switzerland with this ban on constructing minarets. But that, that felt a little bit like Jean-Marie Le Pen, right? Accidentally winning 16% of the vote in a French election, a French primary. And Le Pen is, not a good guy, sort of an overt racist. And do you think that there's something like what we saw when Le Pen won, that is there some sort of, some undercurrent, some backlash, some ungenerous, uncharitable, sort of mean-spirited through line that might be activated by this? We saw sort of, people being nasty to Muslims after 9/11, and we've seen, a real sort of animosity towards people who are foreign-born just sort of creep through the cracks. And you've written a little bit about this, in your discussion of sort of not just white male rage, but sort of this backlash against President Obama. I mean, do you think will we see more of that in the wake of this attack? And how do you think, the sort of standard GOP response?
What frightens me, I guess, about the backlash that I think we're likely to see to this attack, and also again to the Fort Hood attack, is that in a certain way it provides evidence for all the Daniel Pipes and David Horowitzes and the most kind of radical anti-Muslim agitators who are arguing, that there's no such thing as a moderate Muslim, and they might be living right next to you, and they might seem like very much a part of your community, but they're really not.
Right.
I think that all of these narratives, I can't imagine what it would be like to. I mean, I don't know if it's a kind of. I think that it must create new levels of suspicion and new levels of alienation that are just going to continue to reverberate and create ever more distance. At the same time, I think that, particularly in Europe, not so much here, I wish that there was a way in Europe for people to articulate their dismay about some of the changes that their cultures are undergoing. And some of these changes are really negative. I mean, I think it's really terrible, for example, that England is now paying, that you can now file for benefit, that wives in polygamous marriages are now getting kind of, government spousal support.
I hadn't heard about that. That's interesting.
These are all small things around the edges. And, on the one hand, I think it's terrible. I also think, I certainly don't want to see kind of poor women stripped of their government support. But I think that these kind of small changes create real anxieties. And there's no real way to talk about it without seeming like you are a Le Pen or and so.
But is there a political payoff to this? I mean, it's sort of difficult to sort of yoke together these very disparate strands of that have unsettled me about the political world in 2009. It's not, just the Tea Party thing and the sort of the third party candidate in the New York 23 race and the sort of resurgence of sort of Pat Buchanan oriented sort of white populist rage, in addition to what we've seen, as it relates to the sort of rhetoric of terrorism and fighting it. But I'm trying to sort of get my head around the sort of politics of what all of these sort of elements might mean for the future of governance. And I think looking at the Republican response to the Detroit incident has been really interesting, because people have been so willing to sort of demagogue and politicize this in a way that, maybe Democrats just held their fire back in 2001 or when we arrested Richard Reed. But it just seems to me that this is going to be a fight that we're going to have politically. And it's going to be about who belongs and who doesn't belong, and about who's tough and who's not. And it just seems like deja vu. I thought we were past it. Maybe we're not. What do you think?
I think that, I guess I never thought that we're past it. Or maybe I had a brief kind of euphoric moment of thinking that we had made some progress in the aftermath of the 2008 election.
Right.
And since then, this past year has just been this kind of phenomenal return of the repressed, where it seems like not only are we not past it, but that certain really ugly tendencies on the right that had been pretty much buried during the Bush years. I mean, Bush demagogued in a lot of ways, and his administration was, catastrophic from my point of view. But one thing it wasn't, and one thing he wasn't, was racist. He did not, if he tapped into white populist rage, it was in a kind of oblique way and by way of religion. Mm-hmm. So he tapped into the rage of kind of Christians who felt like they were losing control of what they thought had been and was meant to be a Christian nation. But it wasn't this kind. What you're seeing now is a resurgence of a much older kind of right-wing populism. I mean, it's fascinating to me. The John Birch Society is a co-sponsor of next year's CPAC, right? Like the John Birch Society had been completely written out of the conservative movement. It was considered such an embarrassment that they are now making a comeback and kind of becoming respectable. Shows that something kind of far more something that had been festering in American politics for years, and I guess that I didn't think would ever play a big role.
It's coming back.
Somewhat naively, I guess I should have assumed that with a black president, it would all come rushing back.
Yeah.
But I think I suppose I thought that there was, I don't know, maybe a little bit more
a firmer
shame
center
on the right.
Yeah, sure.
Especially since the right has spent the last decade congratulating itself in the most fulsome of terms for getting over its racist past. Right. There was a real kind of concerted attempt actually to make alliances of conservative African American churches and conservative white churches against gays and secularists. And to pretend that because Martin Luther King was a pastor that
there's some natural affinity. I mean, that's
right.
Bush's. I mean, that was not a completely idiotic strategy. I just feel like there's no center on the right. It's sort of. I mean, it's exactly what you saw.
But it's something much less responsible, actually.
Right. Where it's I'll be really interested, and of course, we'll chatter about this endlessly throughout next year. But these elections coming up in November of 2010 are going to be really interesting. A lot of it will depend on the economy, obviously. But it will be very interesting to see what kind of Republican candidates win and what kind of primaries happen on the Republican side. Just because I think that there's been this... I mean, I don't know. I mean, I almost feel like this Detroit incident has thrown a bone to some of the coalition that had sort of fractured. The people who are, upset about the sort of ethnic and religious pluralism that's creeping into the American civic space. People who are angry about feeling unsafe and about the war on terror. There's something that they can sort of sink their teeth into, and we've seen people do it. We've seen folks like, John McCain, Lieberman, Lindsey Graham, the sort of centrists, senators, as well as sort of more, national security hawks, such as, Representatives Hoekstra and King, who have sort of become the folks that you see prancing around the cable news circuit talking about this, and folks like Pat Buchanan, who are like, torture the guy, and they're all sort of finding something to rally around, and most of it is like Barack Obama, slept on the job. And so I do think all these threads we've been discussing are going to sort of, find some... are going to find some kind of purchase as we talk about politics in 2010, and it worries me a little bit. And I don't think the administration deserves full credit for much of their response to this, but it is interesting to see not just the sort of policy decisions that have been made that led to this breach of security, but the politics behind it and what it means for the future of the GOP and about, where we're heading in our...
I mean, one of the things I wish that maybe the administration would demagogue on a bit is that, I have no idea why the security breakdown happened, but I would guess that part of it has to do with all of these unfilled appointments and kind of half-staffed bureaucracies.
And that's, yeah.
And it's actually kind of amazing to me that you don't see more demagoguing about, kind of... Is it Jim DeMint who put the hold on the head of the Transportation Authority because he might, God forbid, let employees unionize? I kind of wish it was. Jim DeMint cares more about big business than your national security.
I don't know why you didn't see that.
In a way, part of what I love about Obama is that he really doesn't do that kind of thing and is really uncomfortable with that kind of politics. But on the other hand, I actually would like to see a much more offensive, to see kind of the left, or not the left, but Democrats really going on the offensive against these people who actually have kind of compromised American national security.
Yeah. And, just to put a bow on it, I do think that they have a really tough job. I mean, they had a sort of crap job when they came into office, but now I just would like to see the administration answer the question of why we're chasing terrorism, where we're chasing it. I think it's a really valid complaint. And, in the piece I wrote for The Root, it was a sort of question of why we've been given this idea that rooting out terror where it lies or whatever, or fighting the last, I mean, even what's happening with security, it's like we're changing our security measures to deal with what happened in the last attack and not looking forward to the next. And I just want to know, what about, I don't want to bomb Yemen. I'm not Joe Lieberman. I don't think we need another country to start a war with, especially one as fragile and unstable as this. But if someone can go to Yemen and then get on a flight to Nigeria and then get on a flight to Europe and then get on a flight to America, it just sort of, it makes you worry about the sort of bureaucratic inability, I suppose, of the United States to really fix the problem. It's a globalized problem, and I don't know that we have the mechanisms, and I think we're spending a lot of money in a lot of specific places and not on the sort of superstructure that might be able to track these threats with a lighter touch.
I wonder how much of it is bureaucratic, is a kind of bureaucratic problem. I mean, obviously, it was in this case why
nobody
someone was alerted to him. But there's also a political problem that rests to a certain degree, in my mind, with the American people, in that I don't think that any politician who ever wanted to be, I don't think the American people would ever elect a politician who told them the truth, which is that we can't stop this. We can't root it out. There is not going to be any coup de grace against Al-Qaeda.
Right.
This
there
is
will
going
be no
to be an ongoing
dead
threat.
Or alive moment.
And what we can do is instead direct our resources to strengthening our defenses, strengthening our intelligence, strengthening all of these systems that failed for several reasons, but presumably part of the reasons that they failed is because of a misallocation of resources. Right. If you had put resources into creating
and like factionalism in the government, like right now everyone's like, well, what happened to the State Department in Abuja? And like, well, why didn't, what's the Director of National Intelligence doing exactly? Wasn't the point of the position to coordinate between this whole alphabet soup of agencies? So yes, it's a bureaucratic problem. And, I think the American people would it's tough. President Obama has promised to tell a lot of the hard truths and telling us, what we need to know instead of what we want to know. But, I think people might be more open to understanding that we have to live with. It's like living with, a disease and not expecting to defeat it. I think people are I think people are there. I think people understand that, actually. It's just our politics won't allow a frank statement of that fact. And so we have to pretend like we're going to get we're going to string them up. And I don't know that the administration can really negotiate that any other way. But I'm curious to hear what you think of Obama's performance in general. I mean, I've been very surprised at how I feel about this first year of his presidency, going into what...
Yeah, and I've been very surprised by that response, which I keep hearing from people, and it especially came home to me over Christmas, where, I almost stormed out of a dinner with my husband's family because they kept comparing him to Bush and saying, oh, he's no different than the last... And I kept hearing that from people who I consider,
kindred spirits.
Decent people who I love and who I don't consider to be lunatics.
Right.
And what's strange, again, I keep trying to kind of cultivate more suspicion of Obama because I think it's important as journalists. I mean, the last thing you want to do as journalists is kind of trust your leaders. But I've been pretty thoroughly delighted with, I feel like he's been really the president I expected him to be. I remember when I thought that the economy was going to go the way of Argentina, and I really, it's bad, but I guess I expected it to get so much worse, and I feel like he was pretty smart and in kind of threading that needle, even though it didn't really make anybody happy, including me, ideologically.
Right.
But he actually, it's been a year. In this year, he has staved off total economic collapse, passed some version of major health care reform, put Sonia Sotomayor on the Supreme Court, flew to Copenhagen and got at least something out of a conference that was devolving into utter kind of chaos. To me, that's actually pretty good for a first year. And he's also, and I guess I kind of do feel like he continually does try to tell the hard truths. I mean, his Nobel Peace Prize speech was like a perfect example of that. I mean, everything in it, you felt like here was this kind of incredibly wise, intelligent, searching person who was genuinely grappling with the kind of, terrible realities and hugely imperfect options before him. I just, again and again, he's not done anything. There's things he's done that I think that I wish they wouldn't do, I wish that they hadn't, I certainly wish that they hadn't, that they were stronger in putting in getting some of their nominees through instead of kind of letting them languish. There's a whole bunch of things but there's never been anything that seemed like, that he's done that seemed like a kind of outrageously bad decision given the situation that he was faced with.
Right.
When I've spoken to people, they've said, well, it's not a job of the president to just kind of acquiesce to reality. It's the job of a leader to try to change reality, to kind of try to change the facts on the ground. I've never really felt that way. I've always thought that it was the job of kind of political movements to change the debate and to kind of change the political reality, and that's the job of politicians.
I think that's one thing we learned in 2009.
But I don't think. But it's never a politician. I mean, when has a politician ever been out front of kind of social change?
Right. I mean, there's the famous line about Lyndon Johnson and MLK. He's like, "Make me pass civil rights legislation." Sure.
Wait, was that? I always thought that was a line about the labor leaders and FDR.
Oh, that's funny. See, again, it's one of those sort of adages that gets repurposed.
Yeah, it might just be kind of
depending on which high school graduating class you're talking to.
Right.
Look, I mean, I want really badly to be really excited about this first year and the next 3 years of Obama's first term as president. I really do. I think that there have been great things that he's done. And, we have a piece coming up next week that looks at, promises he did keep, which are things like reforming the Civil Rights Division, signing the Fair Pay Act, getting things moving, saving the economy, whatever. But I just think that it's been such a letdown, given the frame that you've laid on, which is that we had a really important sort of sense that politics were changing. I kind of believed in that. I no longer do. And I should have maybe known better because I've been in Washington for longer than Obama's been president. It's really hard to do things. And there's so much, I know that Washington is sort of a terrible place where bad things happen and where politeness and sort of centrism are sort of virtues instead of what's right and what's just. But what I dislike is that Obama has sort of pretended like he's changed that discourse and speaks as though he has when he has not. Continuing to engage with Republicans might be part of some grand sort of Jedi mind trick strategy where they look bad and he looks good. But, that's not really the case.
Yeah, that's kind of what I think it is.
Yeah, I know that there are a lot of people, Mark Schmidt has written eloquently about this at The Prospect, and I think that there is definitely some truth to that idea, that Obama's sort of, doing a big, elaborate rope-a-dope. But at the same time, pretending that they didn't give away, shameful pork, to, for example, Nebraska Senator Ben Nelson, in order to get the health care bill done. Pretending that they didn't campaign on the public option when they did. Pretending as though, it's fine to give Joe Lieberman whatever he wants, and that they didn't really mean to close Guantanamo in the first year. And it was a huge victory, on Copenhagen. It just sounds like spin, when if you're paying attention, you know that this is not the case. And so that honesty, that sort of promise of leveling with the American people and keeping it super real, while I totally believe in and respect the sentiment behind that, just haven't seen that played out, and it's disappointing to me. Just tell us the truth.
Okay, but let's take just a couple of these examples. I think Guantanamo is hugely disappointing, but I also think that he's really, really, it seems to me that they've made a real effort to close it, that they're making a real effort to buy this other prison. I don't think it's the kind of thing that they are stonewalling and hoping that people forget about it.
No, but they still have Category 5 detainees that might have to stay there forever. And that's not something that they, sure, they had a lot of nasty people who've been mistreated and that landed in their lap when they took office. But I'm just talking about the sort of rhetorical displays where you're telling us, it doesn't matter that China doesn't respect human rights or is a democracy because we're realists. Or pretend, But
wait, what do you mean about China? Because I was, it's interesting. In another life, I used to do a lot with, kind of Tibet issues. When I was in my mid-20s, I lived in Dharamsala, which is where the Dalai Lama
That's cool.
The Dalai Lama lives as a government in exile. I was an English teacher at a school for Tibetan refugee monks. I later visited a lot of my students' families in Tibet. It's like an issue that I really care about really deeply. And when he first went to China and he didn't meet with the Dalai Lama, and then went to China and kind of made a decision specifically not to bring up these issues, I was really angry, and I was going to write an article about, something like Obama sells out the Dalai Lama, or Obama sells out the Tibetans. And then I called Robert Thurman at Columbia, who's, really close to the Dalai Lama, was ordained by the Dalai Lama, is very much involved in Tibetan issues, and he convinced me. He said, look, this is what the Dalai Lama wanted him to do. This is...
Not to rock the boat.
It's not to rock the boat. He's just like, Obama sent Valerie Jarrett to Dharamsala to meet with the Dalai Lama before any of this happened. It was the most kind of high, no president has ever done that before, sent an emissary there.
I'm sure
they
all
kind of
appropriate
discussed it and
protocols
said,
are
like,
being observed, because they're very meticulous.
It's not even to me that the appropriate
at the White House.
Protocols are being observed. It's more that he's kind of not interested in making statements that would be, kind of emotionally satisfying, but futile in terms of
okay, and I love that line in the Nobel Prize speech. It doesn't have the like, oh, it's so great, I don't even want to mingle it. But the line about how it's not, as satisfying as the indignation of moral purity or something like that. I totally get that. And I think that he's just, practical. And it's important to have a smart and practical president. But what I don't like is feeling like I'm just being, like, straight up bamboozled, where you're telling us that we're drawing, we're doing a quick surge, and we're gonna get in and then get out. I mean, I just, maybe this is comforting and people can swallow it, in their living rooms or whatever, but I listen and I watch and I just feel like, telling us that it's tricky stuff, like, and this sounds so bad because I'm just, like, basically just, like, taking out all of these pot shots on the president when I think he's been doing a good job on a lot of fronts. But, saying that, starting with the inauguration speech, that this has been the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. Every speech, I look at those transcripts. He mentions it whenever he's talking about the economy. And it's a way of lowering the bar for his ability to bring the economy back from the brink, right? By calling it the greatest economic crisis, the Great Depression, it deflects attention from, like, what's going on with banking reform and all of that, which is, nightmarish and bad. So I just don't like the sort of the rhetoric of, don't you see all this hope? Don't you see all this change? When, in fact, they're sort of muddling through the same, dirty struggle that every other president has had to deal with. And I don't like being told that they're flying above this sort of nonsense.
But what could they have done? I mean, just to take, for example, to take these things about Baucus and Lieberman, I don't like seeing Baucus get these, like, ridiculous payoffs in exchange for his, kind of intransigence.
Max Baucus represents 800,000 people. It's extremely
And I certainly hate to see Lieberman being rewarded for his, like, utter spitefulness and viciousness. But what could they have done differently?
I mean, Ben Nelson is not going to get reelected. I mean, the guy won with 64% in 2006. He was a former governor. People liked him. He had name recognition. And he got, he's being, like, slammed consistently in his, at home for voting for the healthcare bill. So he actually stuck his neck out, good for him. I just think that the sort of the temptations of incumbency are extraordinarily powerful and produce horrible things in terms of public policy outcomes. That's been the case for a long time. And if you look at, and I don't know, I hate to sort of keep cycling back to stuff that I've written, but I was hanging out with Senator Roland Burris, who is, go back and read Jeff Toobin's profile of his first couple of weeks in the Senate this year. The guy, nobody is paying attention to what Roland Burris is saying or doing. And yet he's sort of been this cheerful warrior for the public option and for improving, the legislation coming through the conference committee and through the various committees in the Senate. Why? Because he doesn't have anything to lose. It would be so nice.
Well, and he also probably feels like he has to redeem himself a little bit, right?
Sure. I mean, he came into office under a sort of cloud of suspicion. But ultimately, like, the people who are retiring, think of, like, John Warner, who retired in 2008, who was a senator, longtime senator from Virginia. He was the one who sponsored cap-and-trade legislation in the summer of 2008. In a bipartisan fashion. Why? Because he was getting out of there. But everyone else who's trying, I mean, look at Arthur Davis, who's running for governor of Alabama. He is one of the least useful members of the Democratic House caucus right now because he's running for governor, because he wants power. And I'm just saying that this is something that will never change. It's always been that way.
Right, but given that this is something that will never change, I guess that's my point. Given that this is something that will never change, how might the administration or kind of how might a better administration have dealt with, this particular group of politicians that they had to deal with differently?
That's a great question. I don't have an answer for you.
So to me, I mean, there's certain ways to me in which the system itself has proved disappointing, although I guess I never had thought, I had never thought that it was, I had never really thought that, some one person could come in and change.
Okay.
And sweep out all the cobwebs, or kind of change all these like incrustations of corruption and self-interest. I thought that there would be to me the hope was that there would be a kind of thoroughly decent, intelligent, well-intentioned, and kind of non-demagogic person who would put his nose to the grindstone and make the absolute best he could out of a seriously grotesque system.
Yeah. And it's a really, really hard road to hoe. I respect and appreciate the difficulty of the task. But they're just things like, Organizing for America, or all of these organizations that did help push the healthcare bill in a more progressive direction, but ultimately seemed like email lists. And not that I thought that everyone was going to start, running for city council after Obama, after volunteering for the Obama campaign. But I thought something closer to that would happen than to where we are now, where people are, feeling increasingly alienated from their government and hurting in, a sort of really visceral way. As I walk around, the city in the snow, people are in bad shape. And it feels like they don't feel connected to their government. And I think that we'll see that, in the... in next year. We'll see that in next year's election.
Although, didn't you write, to seg into talking about next year, I mean, when we were emailing back and forth, you were saying that you predicted that you don't think the Democrats are going to lose seats in 2010.
Yeah, I mean, simply by virtue of the fact that they have an enormous majority. I mean, a big, the kind of majority they have in the Senate, it hasn't been seen in decades. And so dropping probably 4 to 5 seats, maybe between 3 and 5 seats.
Oh, so you're saying you think they'll lose seats, but they won't lose either house.
And this is a predictions that people feel free on December 31st of 2010 to email me and complain about the inaccuracies of my predictions. But these are sort of just thoughts about what will happen next year politically. I do think Democrats, a lot of this will depend on the economy. I certainly hope that the Congress takes up this jobs creation package as it said it will in January. I certainly hope that another round of stimulus, will be debated and perhaps passed. Because that is what's going to make or break, the electoral fates of the Democratic Party in 2010.
Right, and I have more sympathy when you say people are hurting. I have more sympathy for people who are hurting, people who elected Obama and really thought their lives were going to get better. And, and I have more sympathy for that than for people who were... whose idealism has been bruised.
Well, I guess,
than people whose physical circumstances are remaining vulnerable.
I'm sorry that Obama isn't, Santa. I totally understand that distinction. But I just think that there's such a, it's all interrelated. People who were, they didn't think that a black president was going to solve every problem, but they thought, it was going to bring a little bit more dignity and it was going to bring a little bit more help to the black community or whatever. And, Obama talks about these things holistically. It's people who've been fired and who therefore don't have health insurance, which is why we need to have a system that decouples employment from health insurance. And so it is sort of this, big interwoven mess that is affecting people in ways that perhaps are unexpected but are deeply felt. That sort of ties into the sense of letdown from the president and his agenda. And I just, we'll see. I think the economy is where you start and stop. I mean, I think that's the very beginning of any solution to this problem. But I do think, next year is going to be exciting for a number of different reasons. I mean, looking back on the decade, it seemed like you really can't get any worse. I mean, there's so much horrible stuff has happened. I mean, I got my braces off this decade, so I was chatting with people in the office about how that was awesome. But other than that, it's been, kind of a low, politically, it's been a really disappointing decade, I would say, in terms of where our national conversation
I agree, although to me, like, the kind of, hideousness of the decade in politics is inextricable from the fact that Bush was in office for most of it.
Right.
So, I mean, again, I have to, like I said, cultivate more suspicion towards Obama, but I do feel like that, his election redeemed a lot of redeemed a lot of the stuff that had come before. Not in terms of the suffering that people are enduring, but just in terms of, it had been 8 years of kind of utter hopelessness, 8 years in which it seemed as if, as if whatever was good in the United States was, kind of contracting right. And was about to, kind of completely evanesce. Go
ahead, sorry.
Oh, I don't know. I think I actually feel kind of much more optimistic about this country, certainly, than I did 2 years ago or 10 years ago.
I think there might be, and this is in my predictions for next year, people are going to get tired of Barack Obama outside of America. I'm going to say that, tentatively. Mm-hmm. Not because of who he is or what he's trying to do, but because of what he has to do. I think, no one should believe that the United States is like leading the world on, action against climate change, because it's not. The targets we put forward in Copenhagen were not good enough. And we knew that going in, and we stuck to them, and we didn't move. So all of this talk about being, a helpful negotiating partner may be overblown. What he's going to have to do in Iraq, which is having elections in January, and maybe we'll be out of by the summer of 2011, is going to be unpleasant. What's going to happen in Afghanistan is going to be even more unpleasant, and is going to implicate even more troops from our allies in NATO, and that's going to be annoying, to use a very sort of crude word. Stuff that we should be paying attention to. Stuff like the run-up to a decision about whether Southern Sudan will secede from Northern Sudan. Stuff we should be on. We're not going to be able to address. Other people, other world leaders. I'm thinking of Lula da Silva, who I adore. I'm thinking of China. I'm thinking of, other powers are going to fill the vacuum. And I don't know that, we're quite where Fareed Zakaria says we are in which it's a post-American world. We're obviously a critically important part of the world order. But even just look at the way the G20, the G8 has sort of disappeared and become the G20. These are things that I've been writing about all year and just feel as though, there's going to be a backlash. And it's not because of who Barack Obama is, it's because of what America is having to sort of reap based on the trajectory we were put on by Bush.
But who else is, just let's take, kind of the likely vote for secession in Southern Sudan. At least, I think it's likely.
A new country might be created. Are we even,
Right, but who else, in terms of kind of who is on it, we should be on it, but who is? I don't think China takes that much of a political interest in countries outside of their...
Oh, China will be paying close attention to that.
It'll be paying close attention.
Because, they get a lot of oil from Argentina. They have close political relations.
China will be paying close attention, but China, I think it's actually not terribly likely that China is going to be interfering on the side of good in that particular case.
You're right. But who is going to be interfering on the side of good? Probably not us. See what I'm saying? It's just like we're overstretched.
I'm just saying they're actually... There seems to be a vacuum, not even a kind of sense of an emergency.
You know what? I think you're right.
There's just nothing.
I think that's a much more precise way of describing what I'm talking about, which is that we can't cover, the Horn of Africa and the Indian Ocean. We can't do that while we're fighting two wars. we can't really take care of the butter while we're doing the guns thing, and maybe we can try, and Obama can, work some kind of magic rhetorically. But practically, I just feel like America has reached perhaps the limits of its ability to influence, world events, and that people know that. And so I think that will be a welcome opportunity for sort of other world leaders to be the sort of the heroes of the various hemispheres. And
right. I just wish that there was a leader who was... No, I mean, it's certainly not all bad in that, the United States had not such a great record as being the kind of... But it would be a much more kind of positive thing, it seems to me, if there was... for example, if the Swedes took seriously their design, the Swedes have called themselves a moral superpower, sometimes half in jest, but it would be nice if they actually, if there was someone in Europe who took that role seriously.
Absolutely. I guess I just feel like the defining event of the aughts, or whatever we're calling them.
I don't know why people don't just call them the zeros.
The zeros? I don't know. We need to work on that. Maybe we should brand the next decade before anyone gets to it. It was really sort of a sin of attrition. No one ever bothered to call it anything, right. And then ended. Or will end in a couple of years.
But I think it's easy, though. The teens.
The teens,
is easy,
yeah,
right?
I can get down with that. But it won't be the teens in, 2011. We can have the tweens until we get to 2013, and then it can be the teens. But I guess what I'm saying about the aughts, or the zeros, is that the defining event for me, and I've seen lots of lists, was not the election of Barack Obama, but the events of 9/11. And I think, depending on how you feel about that colors your sort of perception of the decade. 9/11 was more important than anything.
Oh, yeah, that's certainly true.
And Barack Obama was close second, but not that close.
No, I think that's true. And I actually think that your earlier description of it being a kind of decade of terror, and a decade of just kind of, things coming undone is certainly...
unreality, despite the rise of reality television and whatnot. But I've been really enjoying a lot of the sort of... the reckonings, the sort of people my friends are trying to order the years of the decade in order of which was most meaningful to them, and which was, and I've seen tons of fantastic coverage of arts and culture, and it's been really exciting to sort of think back at the stuff that I really dug that wasn't around in 99, I mean, I really like text messaging, I would say, is probably the thing that I think is the greatest accomplishment of this last decade.
For real?
Yeah, I love text messaging. I just wasn't in my life.
Right, I guess that's true, but to be like the kind, I guess, something I keep hoping is going to come along, and I keep predicting it, but it's more just wishful thinking, is that I keep hoping for a backlash against technology and against the kind of all-consuming Borg of social media and this stuff. It might be, I think I'm older than you, and so...
I like the use of the word Borg. I'm going to use that more in 2010.
Actually, if I have a New Year's resolution, it's going to be to spend less time with devices.
That's fair. I really like gadgets. For a chick, I really like the newfangled, the sort of ever more sort of tiny and functional. And I do think that there's definitely a before and after. And, there's no going back to the typewriter age. But, I think you appropriate these tools as best you can. And I think that we've seen this year, that there are uses for, advanced
No, I guess
technology.
I feel like they're appropriating me. Increasingly, and maybe this is just me, but I increasingly see, huge chunks of my life. There's who said it, how you spend your time, how you spend your days is how you spend your life.
Right.
And increasingly my life consists of this incredibly weird, half-conscious surfing around some kind of one of Skinner's rats, looking for a little pellet of information.
Oh, that's too bad. I don't know. I guess, sure. Maybe I just have, come to terms with that and, am no longer anxious about the extent to which my life is sort of tethered to some sort of ticker. But that's, maybe I chalk that up to being a journalist. Maybe that's the way others feel as well. It's not a pleasant feeling, but you can sort of adapt, which is sort of the name of the game.
I guess, yeah, so maybe I just have to, I guess it may be the extent to which you're okay with it is the extent to which you've adapted.
Yeah, but look, I feel like technology is the most important. I mean, I'm all for it. I think the way that folks, look what we saw with Twitter in the election in Iran, and we continue to see that be an actual source of information.
That trumps my bad habits of pressing reload on my email account.
Right. And then, but I also think it's a very interesting conversation worth having about whether, people are able to leapfrog some of the dumb things, that sort of Western industrialized society has done. I think of the way that cell phone use has exploded across, Asia and Africa, where people are using their mobile devices as sort of currency, where you can sort of text money around. That is great. Right. I think that's fantastic. Right. Landlines, are obsolete in places where, infrastructure, we're putting up that infrastructure.
Well, they're not even obsolete, right? They were never there in the first place.
Exactly. And so that's great. Even as we sort of talk about having a sort of more energy efficient, less carbon rich global economy, there are places that are much better positioned to do that than America is. We don't have a series of cell phone towers across the country. That was just stupid. Most places use satellites, right? And so it's fascinating to see, and I will enjoy in the next decade seeing ways in which people improve upon technology that we have developed and create a sort of virtuous feedback loop where, maybe, we'll get a better battery than we can use in our sort of interstate laden, driving culture. So I feel like it's an exciting thing. There are obviously still enormous gaps. I mean, there are places in, I'm sure you saw when you were in rural India, when I was in China this summer, I saw this, where people, are still using kerosene lamps. Certainly the case in Nigerian places. So bridging that gap as well as moving ahead seems really important.
Well, there's places where people are still using kerosene lamps, but are also text messaging.
Right. Oh yeah, which is sort of great. I mean, if anything, these last few years have been sort of about mashup culture and sort of improvisational use of technology for both informational and creative purposes, and I'm way for that. I think that's fantastic. No,
and a lot, and it's true that a lot of times
the thing is to not be evil, as Google says.
Well, and it's also true that traveling tends to, even when you're in places that are fairly desperate, it's actually kind of, in certain ways for me, easier to be optimistic from India. Because you see, especially I've been traveling to India for many years, as kind of overwhelming as the poverty there is, it's astonishing how much, some measures of at least some people's quality of living has improved just over the last decade.
Yeah. And I love India. I mean, I've been there as well. Actually, I think the scarf, you can't see it, is from India, my last trip there. But what I love, and what I think is a very interesting story that we'll have to trace in the next year and those coming up, is the idea of democracy. Because India is this bustling, enormous democracy, and a fairly successful one at that, despite, governmental corruption in places which, is not absent from many different countries that are in emerging markets. But India works. I mean, India works as a democracy.
It works in a somewhat shambolic and kind of sometimes incomprehensible way, but it's actually kind of a democratic miracle.
It's a miracle. And I think that those will be polls. Places like Turkey will be a poll. Places that sort of help to augment the conversation without dominating it in the way that the United States had for so long. I think that will be an extremely productive conversation in terms of world affairs and in trade, and just in human development in the common human conversation. I think those will be very important places to watch and petri dishes for the type of representative government that we're hoping will take root in places in the Middle East and in the unstable states of East Africa and what have you. So I just think the ability to sort of learn instantly from people and from frameworks for governing and for living lives, I think that's the upside of the sort of the BlackBerry culture. And I have two.
Yeah, you're right. And that upside actually, I believe, outweighs the it outweighs the toll on my personal attention span. Yeah. I mean, I think like I said, I think that in the course in terms of the course of human history and the course of human development, it's a hugely positive thing. But in a way, it's like food, right? Kind of conquering well, we haven't conquered mass starvation.
No.
But, conquering starvation was, in many ways, a more urgent problem than kind of obesity in the West.
Right.
But obesity in the West is something you have to deal with, too. And I see the kind of, not just information overload, but the kind of connectivity overload as being something similar. That it's still better to have too much than too little in the world.
Right.
But there also has to be a way of managing.
Right. So what was your favorite... I don't know. I feel like we should do some kind of superlative to sort of wrap it up.
Okay.
What was your favorite... I don't want to say thing because that's extraordinarily vague. Do we want to do movies, art? I've already professed my love for text messaging rather awkwardly.
I'm trying to think of what my favorite new thing was in 2009. Or are we doing the decade or the year?
I mean... I don't know. We could bracket it however we like. I've really enjoyed... there was a really fantastic essay in the New York Magazine's review of the aughts that talked about television.
Yeah, no,
television
I know.
is totally great. Did you read that article?
I was actually going to say that, and yeah, my friend Emily wrote that, and I was going to say that, like, the one kind of true, although it's not like, television existed before the last 10 years, but in terms of kind of cultural development,
TV is awesome.
The rise of, like, television as a major art form.
And it's so deceptive, considering what you sort of have to sort of wade through to get across the moat to the good TV. And so it's counterintuitive, but I think TV's been fantastic in the last decade, in the last several years, and I think everyone should check out
and
this
I'm
piece.
Actually not sure if I can think of any kind of better anything, movies, television, art. I'm not sure if I can think of any better thing, period, than The Wire.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. No, hands down, best show. I also would like to just momentarily recognize 2009 as the year that I began to love Hillary Clinton. You can't see this, Michelle, but I'm in my office, and let me move this way.
Did you ever read? I actually wrote a piece about the same thing.
I spent the entire year of 2008 calling her everything but a child of God, and I've written about my guilt at XX.
It's funny. We should compare pieces because I wrote this piece. I wrote a piece at the Daily Beast. I had hated Hillary Clinton throughout 2008, and I've just been absolutely delighted with her as Secretary of State.
Well, this poster, which I'm trying to illuminate for people who you can't see it, but it's pretty cool. It's like a little bit like those Barack Obama Hope posters, but it's Hillary. She's in a turtleneck. She looks great. And a friend who works for Donna Brazil had about 50 of them, and so I took one for my office and for some of the other Slate people around here. But I think she's done a really remarkable job at being a person, leveraging her celebrity into meaningful interactions with people all over the world. Mm-hmm. And we ignore it because, my job is to chase Barack Obama around Washington. But she has been front page news all over the world all year, and she's worked a lot. And she has been through so many time zones on so little sleep that it just is really incredible to me how comfortable she is in that role as, like, the top diplomat, but not the most important person in terms of the press. And I think she likes it that way because it's lower profile.
Right. Well, it takes some of the pressure off her, and she's, from everything I've heard about her, actually, like, incredibly magnetic and persuasive one-on-one.
She is.
I mean, it actually is a much better... I'm glad that she's not president.
This is a whole other conversation. About what might be different. I think very little would be different if she were president.
I think things might feel a little bit more out of control and shambolic, just because her leadership style strikes me as much less steady.
Oh, that's really interesting. I feel like the Obama White House has had this sort of rap as being like, we don't lose, we don't blink, we twist arms, we get it done. But I guess they've been kind of sloppy in a few ways.
Do you remember the first few years of the Clinton administration? I mean, it just seemed like...
Oh, that's a whole other decade, Michelle, about which I did not yet have braces during the Clinton administration.
So, they were... I mean, I just remember things seemed like they were completely out of control. There was, like, the whole clusterfuck of don't ask, don't tell, and, like...
Now, I wrote a piece for The Prospect last November that talked about the Clinton transition versus the Obama transition. And they were, humming along like clockwork. Many of the same folks who had learned when they were 35 or 40 lessons that they were putting into practice now that they're 60. But I just feel like they've been, I don't want to give the Obama White House too much credit for being on top of their game, because I think they've made some big mistakes. And I think that healthcare is a big one. They let it drag on too long. They sort of weren't in charge of the message, and they, in some ways, overlearned the 94 thing, which is they wanted to give more power to Congress, but then you end up with people like Lieberman and Nelson, sort of, whatever. I cannot swear in life.
Okay, we should go back, though, because we were about to end on such a positive note.
That's right. Well, I think Hillary Clinton has done a spectacular job as Secretary of State. I think she's got the smart people around her and the ear of the president, which people know and respect. And I like that they're working together. So,
and it's actually been in certain, she wasn't even in the Senate when she was
elected in the fall of 2000. So this decade began with, Hillary Clinton as First Lady.
Right, so the decade, so she's kind of completely, she's had 3 different careers, and it has kind of completely overshadowed. She's kind of completely not just redeemed. she didn't really have anything to redeem as First Lady, but she's kind of completely
she's shown that she can do everything. She has had a lot of different careers, and I think she's done exceptionally well in all of them, which is, it's hard to have, ask any of these pseudo-famous people that are celebrities for a minute now. It's hard to have second acts, let alone third, fourth, fifth,
right,
sixth.
And third.
So I think we'll, see more of her, and I will continue to have this super awesome poster in my office. But it's been a real pleasure chatting with you, Michelle.
Yeah, you too. I hope we can do it in person sometime.
Absolutely. No question. Happy New Year, everybody. Enjoy the blogging heads.
Happy New Year.
Till next time.
Okay, bye-bye.